Let's move on to our next speaker, who will talk to us a little bit more about values. The second target is, by 2020 at the latest, biodiversity values have been integrated into national and local development and poverty reduction strategies and planning processes, and are being incorporated into national accounting as appropriate and reporting systems. For that, we have a very distinguished speaker, Pavan Sukhdev. In some ways, I feel I don't need to introduce him. He has been the lead author for the study, The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which has become a foundational work for what we're doing in the questions of valuing biodiversity and working forward. He's now the CEO, founder and CEO of the GIST Advisory Group, and he's a visiting fellow at Yale University. And he spends his time now articulating and working through the implications of his earlier study. Pavan?
Thanks very much, and thanks, Tim, for laying the ground, as it were, in the foundational space of people knowing what is the meaning of biodiversity. So I'm going to talk about. Sorry.
Yeah, we're just coming up with this.
Good. While we wait for that, let me just narrate that if one could go back in history and rename TEEB, I would have renamed it and called it 10, The Economics of Nature. It's easy, trips off the tongue. 2010, the year in which it was launched, and 10 is a nice round number. But I guess one can be wise in hindsight. And so I've actually been discussing with marketing and advertising colleagues what it would take to convert TEEB into 10. In other words, TEEB is 10 kind of thing. And hopefully this will have to be done before 2020, because by that time I think it may be too late. But this is a huge challenge. I think we have done ourselves this service. And partly, I think CBD is also involved, not responsible, but involved, because biodiversity is not widely understood as the living fabric of this planet. The tendency is to think, for people to think of biodiversity as species, warm furry animals, or to think of biodiversity. There was one survey done in the UK which asked what was biodiversity, various things, and one of these was washing powder. And in fact, I think the washing powder won. It gives you an idea as to what people think biodiversity is. It's a nice idea, biological diversity, but it's not, firstly, an easy word. It doesn't trip off the tongue. And it loses one essence of biodiversity, which is the extent that we're talking about, the quantity as well. So it's not just the different types of ecosystems, but it's also the extent, as in the amount of area they cover. That matters, because the quantity of natural area is hugely important to the volume of services that are delivered. Quantity of species matters. It's the quantity of fish in the oceans that's the problem. It's not the number of species of fish that's the problem. Of course, that is also going to happen, but we need to figure out and appreciate that quantity aspect of biodiversity is not widely recognized, even though it is there. It technically is there, but people don't necessarily understand it. And finally, it's about the quantity, as in the variability, as well as the sheer number of genes, the amount of genetic material that there is available. So the quantity aspects as well as diversity aspects are both aspects of biodiversity. I think the idea that value is the way to connect with biodiversity has a deep implication, because valuation is a human institution. I mean, we have said this in the TEEB reports everywhere, from the preface to the TEEB for policymakers, to the TEEB foundational, to literally everywhere in the TEEB reports, and also the final, the green colored summary. Valuation is a human institution. Valuation is not the same as price. So when Oscar Wilde says what he says, I mean, he is in a sense stating what's blindingly obvious to any economist, because valuation is a human institution and price is a value economically, which typically is set in economic terms. And the setting in economic terms does not have to happen in markets. That's another point that people miss. You can set a price, which is a shadow price or an accounting price, based on how much something is going to be worth if it's discovered in its absence, or how much something is worth if it is an alternative to something else. If you have a flat in New York close to Central Park, in identical size, height, and distance to the underground, it will be potentially twice as expensive if it's overlooking Central Park versus if it's just 2 streets away. I know this because I have a flat 2 streets away, which I bought for cheap, I thought, because it was not as much. It takes 50 meters of jog to get to Central Park. I'm okay with that. But the point is, I don't have a view when I wake up, and I look at a building. So these are aspects of biodiversity and value which are measurable because you can compare and contrast and figure things out. And of course, there are literally hundreds of methodologies of working out these values. So there are three ways of understanding valuation. The bigger approach is really recognizing value, and that's what human communities do. When millennia ago, human beings evolved an understanding of nature and significance, and to this day there are tribal communities who respect that and believe certain forests to be valuable because their ancestors dwelled there. That's valuation. It doesn't involve any economics at all. It's about spirit. When more than a century and a half ago, protected areas were first declared in the US and the UK, that was for the sake of patrimony, for the idea that areas should be valued because posterity needs to see them. So that's valuation as well. And then and that's called recognizing value. And then we move to demonstrating value, which is about showing, like in the example of the flat that I gave you, that actually Central Park matters to the value of property. I just showed you and you got it. It was not that difficult. And that's demonstrating value. Now, I don't have to do a swap or an exchange between the guy who owns that flat and me who owns mine to be able to prove that actually the difference is $1 million and so on. I don't have to do any of that. I just know because I've taken a ballpark test and I know what the values are. So I've demonstrated the value of the Central Park for property around that area. You can also demonstrate value in other ways. For instance, a lovely example which I like quoting often is in Uganda, where there was a swamp called Nakivubo Swamp, which was at one point supposed to be dammed up, filled up in order to create more land for agriculture and human habitation. It was found that the economic value of that swamp as a absorber of human waste from the city of Kampala was actually 8 to 10 times more than the economic value of that swamp dammed up and used for other things. And for that reason, that swamp was conserved effectively as a natural sewage treatment plant because of its economically demonstrated value. Nobody paid the swamp anything. The mosquitoes were not, receiving invoices or anything like, or issuing invoices for the work they do, or the fish in the swamp for eating up human sewage after the bacteria and so on. So these are demonstrations of value. You don't need it to pay or receive anything. And then finally, you can capture value, as in most examples of payments for ecosystem services. All of these three matter, and the different strategies that we talk about, when Target 2 talks about integrating into national and local development and poverty reduction strategies, you need to recognize that strategies is what you need. And the strategies are diverse and different depending on what you're talking about, whether you're talking about recognizing value or demonstrating value in economic terms, or capturing value, as in someone paying money to somebody else for the service that has been valued. And these are the typical 5 types of strategies that the TEEB reports have talked about. And by the way, there's over 115 examples of these in the European Commission Eye on Earth website. You can go click to the location and then you can drill down and get more detail into that. But these are strategies such as changing regional plans, as in Baoxing County in Beijing, based on where ecosystem services come from. Or legislations like protected areas, like the Pumaata Reef, post-1998 in the Philippines, legislation to create a protected area in reefs because you were concerned about the loss of ecotourism and fisheries especially. And finally, you can have examples of certification and valuation of protected areas, numerous examples where you can introduce certification and introduce product labeling to improve the value of what is sold, which is produced, for example, in South Africa, in Stellenbosch region, you can have Fynbos-friendly wines, and they will attract higher value because they are produced in a certain certified manner, and they can be labeled as such. They will attract higher premiums. And then payments for ecosystem services, and there are literally dozens of examples all of you are familiar with, which relate to freshwater, global examples which relate to carbon storage and REDD+ and so on. So all of these are valuation. So it's not the case that valuation, the space of valuation is the space of markets. And it's one of the most amazing attitudinal and intellectual problems that I find people don't understand that. I mean, the entire countries will think that valuation means marketizing everything. And that can't be right because that's not what it is, that's not a fact. There are different layers of valuation, it's a human institution. Yes, you can use markets, but if you notice all the strategies that I have talked about, and in fact, which are in the TEEB report, all except 2 out of the 130 odd examples are in fact not market examples. So anyone who's understood the issue or read the TEEB reports should immediately understand that actually valuation is a huge lot bigger as a human institution than markets. Valuation, therefore, is not equal to price, and price only applies to markets where there are privately traded goods and services. Public goods and services don't trade in markets. Pigs will fly sooner than that happens. And when you try and convert a public good or bad into a private claim and then create a market for it, just see how difficult it is. If we've got the example of the EU ETS, the European Union Emissions Trading System, and how difficult it's been to get that going as a marketplace. It is truly a huge challenge, and you created effectively a derivative, this horrible D word that people otherwise have a problem with. You created a derivative of carbon emissions and then traded that after capping it. A cap and trade system is an example of a derivative of basically a public bad which has been converted into a private claim. Then you can create markets for that. But that's the complexity. Markets don't solve all problems. Markets certainly don't solve social problems. And if you twist them into solving problems of public goods, it's hugely difficult. We've seen examples of why it's difficult. And therefore you need a combination of the other spaces, the other institutional spaces, such as economic mechanisms, and such as policies, and such as regulations, and such as norms. And all of these can be informed by economics. It is not the case that you need to have a policy which ignores economics. It is certainly opposite. It is the opposite. That's true these days. And it's certainly not the case that you need every economic mechanism to be a market mechanism, which means many buyers, many sellers, and a commodity type product. That's not the case. There are some which conform to that, most don't. So these are some of the issues which have to be considered. And I think this becomes especially important when we are talking about values to a community and values of ecosystem services to the poor. And here let me explain another area of misunderstanding that takes place, because the typical approach towards measuring ecosystem services tends to look at it at a biome level or at a national level, and does not necessarily compare what you're valuing to the relevant denominator. So you would typically say, well, ecosystem services are missing, they're invisible. Yes, all that is true. They are economically invisible. Yes, they are missing from the national accounts. Yes, they need to be adjusted into national accounts. All that is true. But the point is, adjusting international accounts alone is not the answer, because here there is a double whammy as a result of firstly missing the ecosystem services, and secondly not understanding how significant they are as a proportion of the livelihoods of poor communities. So there's a double problem taking place. One is the economic significance, and the second is the social significance, and especially for poverty. Because if you think who benefits from these ecosystem services, especially in rural areas, really it is the small farmer. The nutrients and fresh waters don't come through the forest to the aquifers to the fields, poor farm suffers. If you can't let your goats and cattle enter the neighborhood forest for leaf litter, it's the poor farmer. If you can't go there for fuel wood, it's the poor farmer's wife. Where there are losses, it's typically the small farm that suffers. The large farms usually have alternatives, as in pesticides, fertilizers, and irrigation. And I think that understanding, when we build that into an appropriate economic model, itself informs us of what the challenge is, because it is about recognizing the value of ecosystem services as not a fraction of GDP, but as a fraction of the GDP of the poor. And that's the understanding that I think our politicians very often tend to be missing, and I'm pleased that the TEEB reports have done a little bit in changing that lack of understanding. But a lot more needs to be done. We need to set up metrics on the ground. And frankly, it's difficult convincing even people in the space of biodiversity and ecosystems. I remember there was this ecosystem services project, which basically is a financing project for connections between ecosystems and poverty. And it was quite difficult convincing colleagues that that was a worthwhile project from the point of view of financing it. So it's not obvious, it's not a given that this will happen. I think we need to work with it. Because ecosystem services, if you add them up and you use an appropriate discount rate, effectively are equal to the natural capital of the country. And remember, nature is something big, wondrous, and complex. Within that, there's values that you just understand as a human being, and within that, a subset values that you can demonstrate economically, and within that, values that you can capture economically. The reflection in economic terms of the ecosystem services that you can capture, that's basically natural capital. And reflecting that in national accounts is important. Otherwise, you are not managing because you're not measuring. And that's the typical problem that happens. And here are a couple of examples of work that was done by Partha Dasgupta and his colleagues some years ago in 2010, published in 2010, where you can see that if you look at ecosystem services and you look at natural capital, the difference between domestic net investment in India and China is quite significant if you include or do not include energy depletion, mineral depletion, net forest depletion. Forestry, minerals as in dead natural capital, and again dead natural capital as in fuels, fossil fuels. And finally, carbon emissions. If you account for all of those factors, then your domestic net investment in China is not 30%, it's more like 22%, and in India it's not 12%, it's more like 9%. So we do have a problem here that the differences in what is being reflected in national accounts and what's the reality is quite significant. And this is why we need national accounts to start reflecting natural capital. This was actually the challenge that some colleagues of mine, some of whom may be here, I don't know if I push them around, but they and Rajiv and Sanjeev and myself decided to let's attack this in our country, in India. And we set up a whole series of green accounting monographs where we looked at the major externalities of natural capital. All of the losses of natural areas, and particularly forests, leading to their impacts on society, either through the loss of ecosystem services, nutrients, freshwater cycling losses, or the actual loss of biodiversity and its values for both ecotourism and bioprospecting, or the actual loss and degradation of ecosystem services for the value they deliver to agriculture, and freshwater even for human consumption. So we published a whole string of monographs. The last one actually got delayed by 3 years because we were all busy with the TEEB project, so it's just being published right now. But what we particularly concluded in the case of India's forest cover, and that gives you a quick picture of India's forest cover, it's very patchy, as you can see. It's largely in the northeast and in the Terai, in the Himalayan foothills, and in the Western Ghats, and a nice large area in the middle, which is becoming increasingly patchier. But it's still there, and it needs to be valued. We created an accounting framework which was reflecting the accounting framework of the SEEA 2003, which had been published around the time we began. And it's basically looking at stocks and flows, and looking at accounts for area, accounts for physical biomass, and then finally the monetary equivalence of these accounts. So there are 3 layers at which these accounts operate across Indian states. And you have to calculate all of these changes in stocks, opening stock to closing stock, due to the various factors, which could be anything from losses due to logging, livestock grazing in pasture land, and so on and so forth. And then finally, you have to set that up as a consistent accounting framework, and this is what we did here. The results were quite interesting because we found that the missing ecosystem services were quite significant as the dark yellow bands. I'm sorry, the numbers are not visible, it goes far behind, but you can have these pathways. And the light ones are even more interesting because those are the actual capital losses. So when we have physical capital in national accounts, net investment is adjusted if it's depreciated. If factories burn or buildings are lost and so on, then yes, that comes into national accounts. But if nature is lost, then that doesn't. And if the soil quality worsens, then that is not reflected. If the fresh water is polluted, that is not reflected. Even though the cost of restoring water to its original quality, or the cost of restoring soils to their original fertility is huge in economic terms, that's not reflected in national accounts. And these are the challenges that national accounting for natural capital is trying to address. All of us who were involved in this project learned many things during the 6 years that it took to produce the monographs and churn the data. And I think the most important thing was the challenge of data itself, because you have to optimize. There's no such thing as perfect data. If you want perfect data, you can keep waiting until the Earth is gone. You will then possibly even then not get it. And the first thing to understand is that data availability and data quality is not good, but you need to get something there, and that you need to rely on more sources than one. Diversity of sources itself is a challenge because sometimes different government departments do not have consistent data. I'm describing the Indian situation because a lot of this was all of the data that we used for these national accounts and state accounts for India was basically from the Central Statistical Organization and the NSSO and the Forest Survey of India. So these were official statistical databases. I think the second lesson was that it's very important to be transparent. You will have to make assumptions if you're doing green accounting or green adjustments to account or adjustments to natural capital. But you must state your assumptions. It's better to have clearly stated assumptions which lead to wide ranges or lead to estimates rather than to sort of wish the problem away. And also it's important, thirdly, to compare, because a single number may be big, may be interesting, and may look good, but the point is, what use is it if someone does not know what it is from one state to the other, or from one year to the other, or from one social and economic context to the other? And unless you can create these comparabilities, then the value of the national accounting adjustments is diminished. And finally, policy relevance. I think you have to be, and that is the TEEB approach, you have to very focus on policy sectors. Pick your sectors. Start where you are challenged, whether it's in freshwater or desertification or soil fertility, wherever your challenges are, start there and recognize for a start what are the ecosystem services that are going to impact that, and make doubly sure that those ecosystem services and the biomes that generate them are definitely included in such a framework. People, and the fifth point is, we learned, is that whilst inclusive wealth is much more satisfactory, the way that Partha Gupta or Collier and Mailer, my guru, likes to do it and have asked us to do it, was to make measurements of inclusive wealth. And they said, why do you want to go about adjusting GDP? Well, you have to do the same calculations for either, because calculating adjusted GDP is also about measuring opening stocks and closing stocks and the differences. So it's not as if you're going to end up with a different degree of effort in calculating inclusive wealth versus calculating adjusted GDP. But when you're communicating, to your point, Tim, when you're communicating inclusive wealth, people don't get it. People just don't know what you're talking about. But if you tell them that GDP is not what you thought it was, they wake up and with a start and they fall off their chairs and say, what do you mean, minus 1%? Yes, because you just had depreciation that you didn't account for. So the answer isn't plus 8.5, it's actually minus 1%. That shocks them, that communicates. So the reason we chose the adjusted GDP approach, the environmentally adjusted GDP, as against choosing the other, was actually this. That was the reason, it was communication. And finally, we learned that it's easy to hire economists, there are lots of them, and there are lots of macroeconomists, but hiring resource economists who understand GDP accounting, this, you're down to a handful. And unfortunately, or fortunately, for us at least, many of that handful happens to be in India, so I got lucky in that sense, having amazing resource support, and one of them is right here with us. So we have an important challenge out here. Now, next steps, and where do we go from here? I think the first step is that the wealth accounting and valuation for ecosystem services, the World Bank project, should publish its accounting framework. As I mentioned, unless people know the framework, they don't know where they're going. So publishing the framework, the accounting framework, is like telling people the road on which they must journey. You can tell people the road on which to go. You can't tell them at what speed to go and how quickly they must start. That's up to them. So the first movers will first have to go through their country TEEB studies to calculate all of the ecosystem services that are relevant for policy. And then from that biophysical information, the area accounts and the physical biomass accounts, will come the national accounts, the conversions of those biomass amounts into monetary terms. Then these same first movers, the ones who hit the road first, can go ahead and produce their waves-based national accounts. And then hopefully after that, waves can look at what's been done by the first movers and publish what I call methodology guidance, because depending on who you are, where you are, who's valuing and so on, methodologies change. There are different methodologies for sometimes valuing the same services. And finally, all of this has to be reflected in hopefully an updated SEEA manual, the UN manual, which will reflect a huge achievement, because current SEEA manual 2003 doesn't really capture the essence of ecosystem services. And finally, when people have all of that, I think at that point, target number 2 would have been achieved. Thank you very much.